All ready, John.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's great to be talking to you and with you. And welcome to the Global Ecosocialist Network meeting on the very topical subject of war, militarization, and the environment. In the past couple of weeks, of course, we had the latest IPCC report on the catastrophe facing the planet unless action is taken very urgently, but it was totally overshadowed in the terms of media coverage by the current Ukraine war in Ukraine. So it makes this topic very, very relevant. My name is John Molyneux. I'm the Global Ecosocialist Network Coordinator, and I will be chairing this discussion. Before I introduce our excellent speakers, I just want to say a couple of words. I don't think in this format a minute's silence is really appropriate, but I do think we can just pause a moment to reflect on all those who have died in the current horrible war in the Ukraine and the equally horrible ongoing war in Yemen, as well as those who have lost their lives in other recent conflicts in Afghanistan, Palestine, and other parts of the world. So I'll just pause us for a second to show our respect to all those people. Okay, thank you. In the context of this meeting, I want to say that it seems to me that in terms of the social movements, particularly the peace movement or anti-war movement and the environmental movement, in the majority of cases, the issue of war and the issue of the environment are seen in separate boxes. You're an anti-war campaigner, you focus on that and geopolitics. You're an environmentalist, you focus on emissions and climate change and so on. And this division into separate boxes is absolutely the case with the mainstream media. They don't see any crossover at all. Well, I think this is greatly to the advantage of the powers that be and greatly to the disadvantage of people who want to see the survival of humanity and a better world. It makes it possible for the media to engage in vast amounts of greenwashing at the time of the COP26 conference, and then say, forget all about that, there's now a war on. Anyway, our speakers today will help us to join the dots between these two matters of vital concern for everyone on the planet. Our first speaker will be Brian Champ. Brian is a climate justice and anti-racist activist in Toronto, as he puts it, so-called Canada, otherwise known as Turtle Island. And as he has just said, he is also about to become an anti-war campaigner. And he has particular links with an experience with the Indigenous struggles in Canada. Our second speaker is Glenda Cimino, and I just explained that unfortunately our build speaker, Kathrin Vogler from Germany, had to pull out at the last minute. And Glenda has very kindly stepped up at extremely short notice to take her place. We're most grateful to Glenda for this. Glenda is an American by birth, now living in Dublin. where she is a long-standing anti-war campaigner and member of the steering committee of the Irish anti-war movement, and also somebody with long-standing concerns about environmental issues. So the format of the meeting is we will give Brian, who will speak first, and Glenda about 15 minutes each. Then we will be open for discussion, questions from the chat, points from the chat, and questions that arise in the conversation between Brian, Glenda, and myself. So without further ado, I will introduce Brian. Off you go, Brian.
Okay, thank you very much, John, and thank you for hosting the meeting, and thank you, Glenda, for agreeing to speak on short notice. And can everybody hear me okay? Okay, yes. Great. I'd like to start, as John mentioned, I've been involved in building Indigenous solidarity actions, working with Indigenous people to put forward demands on our government because of the colonial history and the ongoing colonialism that's going on. So we often start with the land acknowledgement. So I just want to give one for where I am. As a settler living in Toronto, I would like to acknowledge the land I'm on, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto is in the Dish with One Spoon territory, which is a treaty between the Anishinaabe, Mississaugas, and Haudenosaunee that bound them to share the territory and protect the land. And they were to share the territory with only one spoon, and significantly, there are no knives, and that is, you know, extremely important in the context of what we're talking about, because no knives mean no war. It means that working things out peacefully, and that is what we hope to do under that treaty. And subsequent Indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans, and all newcomers have been invited into this treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And I'd just like to point out that just this past Thursday, after being snubbed by the Royal Bank of Canada, who the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs were going to the Royal Bank of Canada, calling for them to divest from the CGL pipeline, they marched through the city of Toronto. So there's ongoing Indigenous solidarity actions, and it's in the context of Canada, this is incredibly important for the climate and environmental movement in any case. But I will get to the topic of the day, and that is war, militarization, and the environment. And so the brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine, after decades of tension around NATO expansion eastward into Russian spheres of influence, has put the world on a knife edge of potentially escalating conflict. At odds are imperialist blocs that are definitely of different economic strengths, but each have nuclear arsenals with the potential to leave large areas of the planet uninhabitable for many generations. And in Ukraine, where there are many nuclear reactors, the potential for the breach of radiation containment structures adds another wrinkle to the question. The environmental impact of war is not only related to nuclear arsenals, however. So-called conventional weapons pack an environmental destructive punch. Napalm, defoliants like Agent Orange, depleted uranium used for armor-piercing shells. The immediate destruction is compounded by ongoing environmental degradation in the areas where these weapons have been used. The danger in Ukraine for escalation to direct war between rival imperialist blocs could magnify the destruction, with the prospects of whole economies directed to produce for the war effort, escalating the conflict to potential world war, and with environmental destruction that much higher. But with the climate crisis, the environmental impact of war is not just the effects of weaponry in the field of battle, but the carbon emissions associated with the operation of the machinery of war. The US military, in their peacetime, quote-unquote, operations, emit more carbon than whole countries like Denmark or Portugal. For military equipment, power trumps fuel efficiency, and the intensity of emissions is very high. We have no way of knowing for sure how much carbon militaries around the world release into the atmosphere because they are exempted from reporting. and there are other problems with those accountings anyway. But if these numbers are high during non-battle operation, the carbon intensity of conflict between armies of such battle machines will be that much higher. War is not compatible with the goal of keeping global temperatures from rising more than 1.5 degrees, which the world's leaders have committed to once again at last November's COP meetings in Glasgow. However, disappointing the promises they made, because they could not even agree to stop producing and burning coal, much less phasing out fossil fuels. Fighting wars, even if it is quote unquote for democracy, which is obviously a laughable goal in the current context, as some pro-NATO commentators say, is not compatible with these commitments. If the wars are for control of fossil fuels, it is quite clear that this puts the world on a trajectory towards far worse climate outcomes. The fact that Russian LNG supplies to Europe play a role in this conflict further demonstrates the difficulty that capitalism has of transitioning away from fossil fuels. So in Canada, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was a story in the Financial Post that came up almost immediately in the first few days about how the European energy crunch and the conflict had breathed new life into an LNG project on the east coast of Canada, over the prospect of supplying LNG to Europe. The impact of the war on oil prices had also changed the economics of pipeline construction and tar sands development, with higher prices suddenly making these projects more profitable. During the pandemic, campaigns had targeted divestment of financial institutions and insurance companies from fossil fuel projects, and they had made inroads because the oil prices had been low and the increased costs due to blockades and other resistance had made investors wonder if they'd see a return on investment. I won't get into the economic contradictions of the rival blocs that could be developing as we speak, but it's out of the context of what I'm talking about today. But in the Canadian context, we're seeing an increase as the call from NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg called for member countries to spend at least 2% of their GDP on military spending. So in March, Canada's Defence Minister, Anita Anand, announced the exploration of options to increase military spending, exceeding the 2% level, hitting the 2% level, and below the 2% level, and putting these options up for consideration. But the truth is, the Department of National Defense, or D&D, is the largest department of the federal government, spending $24.3 billion and consuming 7.1% of federal spending. Raising the D&D budget to 2% of GDP would raise this amount to $41.4 billion, or 12% of the federal spending. So while the new Liberal climate plan is a terrible plan, also because it doesn't actually take the right kinds of actions, it funnels billions to false solutions like carbon capture and storage, and pretends that market mechanisms can lead the transition. But even though this plan will not stop the climate crisis, it's instructive to know that the D&D budget, the increase that it would take to go to 2% of GDP, is almost twice as much as the entire budget for the climate plan under the federal Liberals. Similarly, the federal government has promised $6 billion over 10 years, or $600 million a year, to fix drinking water problems in Indigenous communities, following decades of inaction. But this is just 3% of the increase in military spending. $17 billion could be used to build 600 kilometers of surface rail light rapid transit in our cities. It could be used to install solar panels, supplying all the electricity for 450,000 homes. We could build 20 new hospitals every year, rapidly increase education, healthcare spending. In Canada, if the 2% military spending increase goal is reached, it would roughly be the same as the Canada Health transfer from the federal government to provincial health programs of $43 billion per year. If the entire military budget were eliminated, the health transfer could be doubled to dramatically improve underfunded hospitals. and the numbers are similar for education budgets. So it's clear from when you look at the climate plans that there's, while the rhetoric around climate is very thick with the liberals, that there's not a lot of money and there's a lot of hypocrisy going on. And so the fact is, if we hope to be able to achieve the just transition to a zero carbon economy for the sake of the planet and future generations, the war drive of our rulers must be stopped. We simply can't afford to waste the opportunity and money on programs that will further the crisis and destruction of the planet, when we need those resources to be targeted towards halting the runaway train of the capitalist economy that is undermining the life-supporting capacity of the Earth. The fantastic anti-war movement in Russia, where tens of thousands have been arrested and potentially face years in jail, but yet the protesters still keep coming out, is inspiring. It's a beacon of hope. We need to continue to build opposition to our own rulers' drive to war, following the example of those risking so much in Russia. This means calling for an end to NATO as an imperialist force, and here in Canada, calling for Canada to get out of NATO. It means calling for an end to supplying arms and soldiers to Eastern Europe, while supporting humanitarian efforts and then increasing humanitarian efforts to the region. It means in supporting and amplifying mass involvement of Ukrainians and standing up to the Russian occupation, and then building the links between anti-war forces on the ground internationally, between Russia, Ukraine, and in the West. We can create pressure on our rulers to back away from pursuing these aims. But it also means the end of arms shipments from the West to allies in the Middle East, such as Israel and Saudi Arabia, to uphold imperial interests in the region. Israel uses their military might to project power in the region, but also to wage war on Palestinian population. Saudi Arabia has led the assault on the people of South Yemen, a war that gets scant mention in the Western media. And there are many other conflicts around the world, and the main inter-imperialist rivalry is really between the US-led bloc and China, not with Russia, although the contradictions abound in that because of the interpenetration of their economies. But saber rattling in one region can increase tensions elsewhere, and proxy wars or more direct wars between the main powers can flare up in the context of these overlapping crises of late capitalism. Climate and environmental movements worldwide are fertile ground for building the forces opposing war, because there is already a clamoring for change of course from the system, but the transition is not happening, or it is not happening quickly enough. And that activists are already calling for more money for a real transition away from fossil fuels. When governments dither and obfuscate on climate solutions, but then eagerly spend money on war, this has the potential to provoke anger in the climate movement and a readiness to take action against war, connecting it to the need to fund the transition to a zero carbon economy. This part of a climate justice framework that seeks climate solutions that lead to an actual transition from fossil fuel capitalism towards the zero emissions economy, where no community or worker is left behind. Mobilizing to oppose our rulers' drive to war, whether for fossil fuels or for some other reason, is a key part of mobilizing masses of indigenous people, workers, people from racialized and other marginalized communities, environmentalists and climate activists, to create a force for change from below that can transform the world for a sustainable future. Last November 6th in Toronto, a new network including Indigenous, labor, climate, environmental, and student groups organized a rally as part of the Global Day for Climate Justice during the COP26 talks. Our headline climate justice demands were respect Indigenous sovereignty, phase out fossil fuels, just transition for communities and workers, and global justice. As our rulers pursue the drive to war, we must assert that no war is also a climate justice demand, seeking justice for the victims of the conflict, but also for future generations who will bear the brunt of war spending priorities that doom them to a bleak future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brian, for an excellent introduction covering so many bases. Can I just say that in the chat, it's very helpful actually in this format It's not the same as Zoom. If people will say where they're from and acknowledge that, we've already got to see from the chat a very considerable range of places represented, from South Africa to New York City to Italy to Brazil and so on. So that's very good to see. And also people can already be putting questions and points and so on in. Okay, I'll now hand over to Glenda Chimino to carry on the discussion. Thanks, Glenda.
Okay, first of all, I'd like to say that I agree with everything that Brian said. He's made a lot of the points that I would make myself. One thing that has become very clear during the COVID era is that the political elite will find money for whatever they want to fund, and they're able to do it. They're able to make that transition, but they do not want to make that transition. They're too tied up in the existing capitalist system, the system which relies on fossil fuels, the system which relies on the war economy, the system that relies on arms manufacture and distribution, the system that relies on creating ever more dangerous and critically evil weapons, literally evil weapons. So I'll say something. I'll try to say some different things from what Brian said, but as I say, like everything he said I thoroughly endorse. Martin Luther King said in his Beyond Vietnam speech, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." I think the United States has gone well in that direction. The programs to help people who are in desperate need of housing, of food, of shelter, of all kinds of health care, these have been brushed aside mostly by the Republicans. But the Democrats and the Republicans are like two branches of one party. It's not really a true democracy. And a lot of people, the majority of people in the United States, do not have their voice in Congress. The House of Representatives recently agreed on a huge budget for the military, and they handed the military 594 British pounds, billion, while marking less than that, 550 billion for domestic spending. So the military budget is not only huge, it's outspans every other thing which is needed in society, and it does absolutely nothing good for people. Nuclear power plants were not designed to be safe in war zones, and yet we have 15 nuclear power plants in a war zone in Ukraine, and Chernobyl has already been releasing radiation that they can't measure because the instruments for measuring it went down. And when the electricity supply goes, we all know there's a danger of more Chernobyls, more meltdowns. There's been a change in that it would seem that the rules of war, the agreements of war, the agreements in 1972 to ban biological weapons, the agreements that civilians should not be targets, hospitals, schools, children, these are war crimes. We have to recognize that war itself is a crime, and we cannot talk about climate change and leave war out of the picture. COP26 is a cop-out because they do not ever talk about the cost of war, what is happening in terms of the preparation for war, what's going on during the war, the immediate aftermath of the war, and the long-term effects and consequences of the war. Vietnam is still suffering from Agent Orange. Fallujah and Iraq are still suffering from depleted uranium, and we don't really know what other toxins have been left in the environment to destroy people's lives and make their lives a misery. The development and use of chemical weapons in World War I and World War II also involved careless dumping after the war of those weapons into the world's seas and oceans. And we all know that every once in a while a bomb is found unexploded in a European city and has to be, if luckily they haven't gone off, they have to be, they have to like detach them so they can't explode. The nuclear testing before and after World War II, which the IPCC actually said in a meeting in Dublin didn't really do much damage, that's not true. There's a tremendous amount of damage that was done and tremendous amount of release of like harmful radioactive elements into our world. Deforestation and habitat destruction is rampant in war. Then we have the atomic bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. You would think after that the world would turn away from nuclear weapons. And in fact, most countries have turned away from nuclear weapons, but who has not signed up to that? The countries that have nuclear weapons are still maintaining their arsenals and increasing their arsenals and working, China and the US both working on ways to create smaller nuclear weapons that can be used. So usable nuclear weapons to me is a death goal, not a life goal for the planet. There are links between the military and the origins of Silicon Valley. There's the disposal of chemical and other toxic weapons after war, in a general way, as apart from what's been already dumped into the seas. There's toxic dust. There's the way in which just everyday operation of military vehicles is producing greenhouse gases and air pollution. The U.S. is by far the worst contributor to these things, but all militaries are contributing to this. The consumption of energy since 2001, the Department of Defense has consumed between 77% and 80% of all U.S. government energy consumption. Their emissions, as I think Brian said, is greater than that of several industrialized countries. And the U.S. maintains 580,000 facilities with over 275,000 buildings and over 800 bases located in the U.S. and across the globe. Many times these bases are located in countries that don't want them, and yet they're forced to have them. Cuba has been forced to have its territory in Guantanamo claimed, since the revolution, and they cannot get rid of it, even though it's their land. So we have to find ways of legislating for peace instead of the allowance for wars to happen. Everything should be decided by negotiation and diplomacy, in theory, because if you don't negotiate and have diplomacy before the war, you will not settle the differences through war. You'll just create a lot of destruction and pain and death and misery. And then afterwards, you have to go back to the negotiating table anyway. Zelensky at least seems to recognize this, that in the end, it's got to be a negotiation. I won't deal with the comments just yet. The thing is, what can we do? Like, you might think, well, it'd be wonderful if we could take all these military bases and just transform them to doing, like, things which are good for the environment, working on sustainable environmental buildings, working on, positive things. But they still are wrecking the planet just by being there. And they're not good when they close them down. There's no control of the pollution that goes into the area. Areas that people have lived in have been poisoned now around American bases and possibly other bases too. I only know about the American ones. And with the U.S. Department of Defense spending more on the military than the combined military spending of Russia and China, and increasing that all along, and giving weapons to Ukraine has meant that now they have to buy more weapons from Raytheon and the other weapons producers to replace their stock, to replace their weapons storage. So this has got to end. Anybody with any intelligence can see that you can't fight climate change while you're fighting wars against our fellow human beings, not to mention the destruction of animals and of nature, of the environment. In Biden's government, Mitch McConnell, who's the Senate leader, said the agreements that they have made provide significantly more money than the Biden administration requested for defense, and less than they requested for non-defense. So basically what's happening is the military budget is the only aspect of the American budget that they actually give them more than they've asked for, even if they don't need it, don't want it, can't account for it, lose track of millions, waste it on missiles and jets. They've spent like another $2.25 million to develop a new Air Force stealth nuclear bomber called the B-21. So it just goes on, and it's going to end in death of the planet, death of all life on the planet, or what life survives being completely uncivilized and inhuman. So the only way that we can get around this is by the people recognizing this, coming together, and trying to get rid of the people who are trying to hold us in the fossil fuel trap, in the energy waste trap, in the trap of like producing many, many things that nobody needs, in the trap. They've now found plastic in our blood, in our bloodstream, and they don't really know how much that's going to affect our uptake of oxygen. So we've already gone way beyond repair. We may have gone over 1.5 degrees already, but we have to do what we can. We have to increase our opposition in every way to what's going on, and we have to come up with more ideas. But the problem I see at the moment is that the present situation is being used by the fossil fuel industry to increase supplies to Europe from the US, for one thing. One of the goals was to block Russia's energy provision to Germany and Europe, and also as a pretext to attack Russia. I mean, Russia is completely in the wrong for starting this war and for continuing to destroy the life of people in Ukraine. But we have to recognize that the refugees from Ukraine are being treated very, very differently from the refugees from the rest of the world. Like, what's happening is the contradictions are becoming very, very obvious to everyone. We either treat everyone well or we treat them all badly. But to treat the Ukrainians with special kid gloves, and they deserve good treatment, well, turning away people from war zones like Syria and Afghanistan and allowing people to drown in the Mediterranean and allowing them to be pushed back into Libya where they may be in prisons and treated as slaves. We really have got to open up our eyes to what's going on in the world, open up our eyes to all the world's campaign against war itself being a crime, and not take one war at a time, like the Yemen war, the war in Tigray, the treatment of people in Myanmar. Like the rise of autocratic powers is not going to help our cause. We really need to get the people together and have people action to change things. I think that pressure is the only thing that will do it. In Ireland, of course, there's the additional thing that Ireland is a neutral country, and there's certain pressures going on now for Ireland to join the EU military establishment, to join NATO, and we don't believe that NATO is the answer to anything. If we look back, NATO has started more wars than Russia, although Russia is working on it. And we really can't keep looking for military solutions to social and political problems because they don't exist. Am I going over time here?
You're about right to wind up now, Glenda.
Okay. Okay. The last thing I'll say is that there's a resource-intensive use by the military of resources which are needed for life, not for death. And we need to get away from our death economies. We need to stop arms production companies. We need to stop the production of new weapons and the experimentation of weapons that can kill better and kill more. And to do this, we have to make everybody aware that we are living in a booby-trapped planet. That's the truth of it. We're living in a planet with enough nuclear weapons to destroy the world many times over on many different sides. And we've already survived a number of nuclear accidents which have not been well reported. So we have to really get together now and put in the best effort we can to turn this around. Our world is upside down. We need to get it right side up again. That's it.
Thanks a million, Glenda. And I repeat that, Glenda stepped in at the last minute and we're very, very grateful to her for doing that. These things happen, and that was brilliant, Glenda. So many different issues touched on and so on. I just say, while I'm waiting for more questions, we've had some very good questions so far, but it always seemed to me kind of obvious, the kind of thing that was in your face but never commented on, that you look at an army or a navy or an air force and ask yourself, what does it run on? It runs on oil. How do you drive tanks? How do you drive military vehicles? How do you fly fighters and so on? And that it wasn't that all this never gets mentioned. As I say, we spend our time arguing about, have you recycled enough goods, and have you, are you using the bus, or who's got the right size car, and all those sorts of things, etc. There's huge focus on that from the media in terms of the behavior of ordinary people, and never a mention on the extraordinary consumption of fossil fuels and therefore the extraordinary degree of carbon emissions from the military. it will be, I'm sure Brian will know this, and maybe Glenda, but other people may know that this book, written by a member of the steering committee of the Global Eco-Socialist Network, Facing the Anthropocene, Ian Angus's book, Fossil Capitalism and the Crisis of the Earth System, contains excellent information about the role of the military in fossil fuel pollution and generally in damaging the environment. So I plugged that right. Now, I have a couple of questions that came up early, and I urge people to put questions in. The question that I first saw was from Ivanaldo Leita, which was a question about how we see the role of the UN at the present in the present situation, and a question from Ted Franklin, which I think is a very important question. How do we win the working class and trade unions, because workers are crucial to dismantling the fossil fuel industries and the fossil fuel system? So how can we win over workers and unions on to a progressive? Yeah, Ted, you're putting it's coming up again. Winning working class is key to dismantling fossil fuel industries and military industrial complex. How do we win unions and workers to the fight where the masters of war and oil so fear? Now, I just want to say, I see a question from Thomas Hummel about Ukrainians and their right to defend themselves. Just a word about this. That Jen, the Global Eco-Socialist Network, has taken the position on the war, but a very minimal position, and with good reason. What I mean by minimal position is we've said we condemn Putin's invasion, and we are opposed to NATO expansion or Western military involvement and warmongering. That was our position on it. And there's a host of debates about the war, like on the questions of sanctions, the question of arms supplies, and all sorts of details and rights of different people. And by and large, we thought as Jen, we're a coalition and that we wouldn't take positions on those. So you're welcome to raise the question, but they're just questions people will be just speaking for themselves and so on. So, okay, take us back. Brian, could I bring you in on Ted Franklin's question about how we can win working class people in the unions, please?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I would argue that this is the key question, and because it's something which has been articulated in the climate movement a number of different ways, to talking about a just transition for workers. And then, I think in the context of climate justice, that's usually expressed also as a just transition for communities as well. But essentially, the challenge really is that the scale of the type of just transition programs we need that would transition workers from high carbon intensity jobs to lower carbon intensity jobs, in the context of transitioning energy to zero carbon emissions. The challenge is that scale of that really needs sort of government programs and billions of dollars, maybe trillions of dollars allocated for these types of training and developing new renewable industries and all these types of things. So it's one of the reasons why I am been focusing recently on building like climate justice, using climate justice as a strategy, because the problem is that different areas of struggle have different sort of focuses. But for workers, the climate justice demand is for that just transition, but we need the political force we need to put that on to the mainstream agenda on the scale that's requires like a mass force from below clamoring for that change. So, I mean, I would like to say that I had an easy answer for that, but I mean, it's challenging because until there is like something which seems like a viable program for workers, there's going to be some skepticism that a just transition is going to be on offer. So that's, and when we have like mainstream political parties like the NDP, which is a social democratic party here in Canada, that pay some lip service to the idea of just transition, but the scale of training or jobs is really not enough, or they don't directly challenge the fossil fuel economy, and so their just transition is sort of a sideshow. So anyway, I hope I went some way to answering that, but
thank you very much, Brian. Glenda, do you want to comment on that or on the question about the UN?
Sorry,
You're muted.
I think I'm unmuted now, am I? I think that the UN seems to be a very feeble organization and that it has no teeth. The way it's set up, it can make statements and recommendations, but it doesn't really carry through on those things. I think Brian's quite right that we have to have not only a national but a global strategy to deal with the climate change. And climate justice is going to be different in different places because some of the poorest countries are the ones which are suffering the most, which are already like in drought and famine and, are going to have to move or die. So we have to change our whole attitude. The attitude of Europe has been fortress Europe, keep people out, and the US as well. And we have to change this attitude. We have to take care of everybody. And to take care of everybody, we have to have a transition to jobs that don't actually continue to damage the climate and damage the lives of human beings and animals and everything that lives on this planet. And that is a massive, massive job. And I do believe that if we can increase the awareness of enough people, that they can pressure their governments for that. But the governments themselves have to change. We can't go on with pseudo-democracies and authoritarian states, like making their decisions for everybody else, and then using the media. Luckily, we have other options, although there's efforts to close them off. We have other options to the mass media so that we can get information out there. But how to get it acted on is a very serious problem. And I think that it isn't as easy. I mean, if you could take all the workers in Raytheon and get them to object to producing arms and come up with an alternative. You know who did this very well? Thomas Edison. When one of his factories closed down, he opened it up again, having it producing a new product. I think it was something like cribs and furniture. But it's like how to be inventive, how to create things that people need instead of creating a false demand for things that people don't need, which is what we get all the time through advertising, the media, pushing people into wanting things they don't need. What we really need are basic things. We need clean air. We need clean water. We need to be able to have beauty in our lives. We need to be able to feed, house, clothe, and take care of everybody. We need to stop poisoning the environment so that so many people aren't getting so sick. We need to break the clutch of the pharmaceutical companies who are making money even now off the COVID vaccines, which are already paid for by the taxpayers. So that's why I say the world is upside down and we have to turn it right side up again. It's really, bottom to top instead of top down to bottom. And we've got to do it awfully fast.
Thanks, Glenda. Before I move on to another question, just a couple of comments from myself on these. I think Brian is absolutely right about the centrality of climate justice. The name itself and all the things that it implies in working on these issues. We've formed in Ireland a climate justice Ireland campaign, and we are looking at how to bring these issues together and represent links with workers who may be losing their jobs or facing on things. And also important in that context, and I think this is probably generalizable to many countries, is the demand for free public transport to get people out of their private cars, right, off the roads, into buses, into trains, and something that also is a massive benefit for all working class people. If you've got free, in Ireland, I'm a pensioner, and you have free transport, and it is a huge boom. mean, there's reasons how it came about I won't go into, but you have free public transport. If I want to travel from Dublin to Cork on the other side of, why would I drive when I can go for nothing by train? There aren't enough trains, but that's it. We need free public transport and more of it. But that's we should be looking consciously, I think, for demands that both tackle the climate crisis and make life better for working class people, that we can bring those over on. I also have just a comment from myself on the question of the UN. The UN is presents itself as a body that stands over the whole world and stands for peace and representing the international interests of everybody. But I think this, to be honest, is an illusion. What it really is a body that is a collection of delegates from the major powers. And so consequently, I'm no insult to vegetarians. I just like the joke. It's a bit like a vegetarian who doesn't eat meat between meals. The UN passes endless resolutions for world peace until there's an actual war involving actual people, and then it does nothing, because it's not really standing above the United States or the US and its allies or anybody else. If Russia were the dominant power, they would control the UN, but they're not. So I don't think myself that the UN contributes much to this. There's a question that has come up, and I know this is dividing people on the left, about the question of arms to Ukraine. Now, I'm quite willing to discuss it, but I do repeat that we do this where we're just discussing as individuals, so and not the position of Jen, for obvious reasons. But Brian, I don't know if you want to comment on what you think about that, or Glenda. I will comment as well. So, but,
sure, I could come in on that, and also the question of the right of Ukrainians to defend themselves. I mean, personally, my position is that, in the case of a invasion by a power, the people have the right to defend themselves and fight back. There's no question about that. But when then that creates, channels for the funneling of weapons of war from other major imperial powers to the forces fighting on the ground in Ukraine, then the potential for that to be basically a proxy war between those imperial powers becomes more likely. And I have to say that I don't, my main area of study is on the climate. I'm not like a huge expert on everything that's going on in the Ukraine and everything. So, but these are, so maybe people might feel these are a bit abstract positions, but the thing is if, I think many people have experience from the Iraq War and opposing the Iraq War. And we have to recognize that there's some different dynamics going on here than were happening at that time, and that while it is an invasion of Ukraine, that standing right behind the Ukraine is NATO and an imperial power bloc that is, and so it's like recognizing that fact doesn't mean that we don't have empathy for the situation that Ukrainians are in, and wish that there were better options for building that fight back. But we have to look at what are the repercussions for this, and for possible further developments and so on. So anyway, that's what I would say.
Thank you, Brian. Glenda, do you have a view on this?
I'm of course not an expert either. I'm not an expert on anything really. I just try to do a bit of research.
I don't know about that, Glenda. Not from where I'm sitting.
If you look at the pattern that's happened in other places and look at Ukraine, I do think you've had, foreign interference from all sides in the elections in Ukraine. Back, there was a pro-Russian president in Ukraine, and he was more or less overthrown. There was a Maidan revolution, which some people say was really sort of, infiltrated and partly funded by, foreign forces and foreign militaries and foreign intelligence agencies. So very often you have like real revolts by people being infiltrated by people who want to like push it in one direction or another, and usually nothing to do with what the people need and want in the country in the end. And we've seen that happen in other places where genuine revolutionary movements have been tilted by the involvement of people and groups which are not actually, part of those movements. But then a pro-American president was put into the Ukraine, and he was, very much in favor of them joining NATO, which the previous president was very much against. Like, Ukraine's a quite divided country, and there were agreements that were made, the Minsk agreements, which if they had been adhered to, and they weren't adhered to by Ukraine or Russia, but if they had been adhered to, we wouldn't be in the situation we're in now. Agreement and the use of Russian as a second language, as a major language in Ukraine, was outlawed when quite a lot of people do speak Russian. So you had all these things going on that nobody was paying much attention to outside Ukraine, and the encroachment of NATO on all the states right up to the border of Russia. As someone has said, imagine if, Russia was setting up nuclear weapons and facilities and doing, military training with Belarus and Mexico or Canada. There'd be quite an uproar. So we have to see that as a similar situation. In terms of the right of Ukraine to defend themselves, of course they have the right to defend themselves. But keep in mind, the US and NATO have said, we will defend Ukraine to the death of the last Ukrainian. I mean, Ukraine was put in a bad position with Zelensky. Zelensky, I think, is a genuinely honest man and a decent man. I do believe that. He may also be a bit of an oligarch with all the property he owns, but he is a decent man. And they were lied to. Like, they were basically told, oh yeah, you'll get into NATO, it'll be fine, we'll take care of you. Training was done as recently as last September with NATO in Ukraine. And these things have not gone unnoticed by the Russians. So there was a lot of buildup to this terribly, fatally bad action by Putin and his government. So what happens now? You have a bully. You have like a vast destruction going on in Ukraine, which of course is contributing to environmental and climate deterioration as well. And I hate to see any more people killed. How you can force Russia to come to the negotiating table and have genuine negotiations, how they can get over the difficulties, and that how can Ukraine be kept together as one country when one of Russia's demands is to take out a portion of the country. They took Crimea, nothing happened. There was a war in Chechnya. What did we do? We didn't care about these things, but now we care about this. So I think that, as with any bully, you have to have the right to defend yourself, and when you don't defend yourself against a bully, you get bullied more. But Ukraine is very much in it on its own, just getting lots of weapons. Can they win this war? Looking at Russia bringing in Syrian forces and mercenaries and conscription of people who don't even know why they're in Ukraine from Russia. And yes, there are Nazis in Ukraine, but they're not probably any more Nazis than there are anywhere else in Europe. And they have actually altered a lot in how they've actually display and present themselves. I don't know how much is true because I'm not there, but I think that we have to we don't take a position on whether they should have weapons or not. We do take a position that NATO should not get involved, because that would lead to World War III, and all of the scenarios that have been acted out show that if it is, there'll be total destruction.
Thanks, Glenda. Thank you very much. I think that this format, which we adopted for this meeting so that we could go out on Facebook Live and Twitter and so on, the drawback of it is that you can't bring people in to reply to the discussion and so on easily. You just get the things in the chat. I wish in this situation I'd be more than happy to let, for example, Mark Bonham, who's a Gen member, or who the other people who've raised these questions, to come in and have their say. That would be fine. but this format doesn't facilitate that, I'm afraid. I'm also itching personally to get involved in the discussion, but I'm going to step back from that, particularly as given my role as Global Eco-Socialist Network coordinator, and just shift us back before we come to an end to a couple of other points, more general ones, which I will put to Brian and Glenda to comment on. One is the fact that we have seen in the past, as we know, wars for oil. Number of wars for oil, most spectacularly the Iraq War, but other wars for oil as well. There have been already some wars for water, like the war in Darfur. It was a terrible war in the Darfur region of Sudan. Had at its root climate change, in the sense that water supplies were drying up, and this produced a conflict between pastoralists and agriculturalists that then turned into ethnic conflict exploited by the regime and so on. Do you think that as climate change develops, as global warming increases, we're likely to see more of this kind of thing? And what is also the relationship, is just very quickly, between the question of climate change and the growing rivalry between the US and China? Because China is also a major factor in the question of climate change, is it not? So I don't know, Brian, if you want to come in on that, on either of those. They're just thoughts, and then we'll move towards the summing up.
Sure. I guess on the question of whether these types of conflicts will continue to develop, I think that the system is, the global system of capitalism and the economic crisis, the overlapping pandemic crisis and climate crises, and just the antagonism, the way that the capitalist system and the way that markets, tend to push, homegrown capitalists, to push their national sort of state, to push their interests abroad. And I think that we're likely to see actually more conflicts. And I think it sort of makes it that much more urgent to mobilize those that are concerned about the climate, to oppose conflict that will just exacerbate the problem. So, yeah, I do think that the tensions are increasing, it seems to me. And it's now, having said that, I think one of the interesting things about the Ukraine conflict is the fact that many of the nations around the world have not taken a position on it, have not supported either side. And so that does give one some hope as well, that there could be some sort of mass opposition expressing itself through maybe some of the, getting back to the UN, sometimes the UN can express global protest against the elites, even in their own sort of assemblies and so on. But anyway, I'll just leave it at that.
Thanks, Brian. Glenda, do you have any comments you want to make on these questions?
I think that the question of water wars is a definite thing that's going to increase in the future, unless we have climate justice, unless we make arrangements for people to have fresh water to drink and to bathe and to take care of their animals and their crops. Right now, a huge number of people in the world don't have that. Like every time I turn on the tap, I'm quite careful with the water, because in my mind is thinking about the women that have to walk miles every day just to bring back a bucket of water. And sometimes that water is polluted and their children get dysentery. In my own family, we had cholera. When my grandmother was a child, my uncle died at 2 from cholera in Georgia. So these things exist around the world, but some places are obviously much worse than others because people don't have the resources. And when on top of people not having the resources that are there are bombed, of course we're creating more and more difficulties for the world. I won't talk about Ukraine. We all are aware of the way in which people's lives have been disrupted by not having electricity, not having water, having to live in basements, no heat. And this is not the future that we want for our world. But I think what we haven't looked at all enough is the role of technology in using up water, for example, like data centers use a lot of energy, they use a lot of water. And we just are building those all over the place without thinking about what we're doing. 5G, like a lot of scientists say that 5G is actually going to be poisoning people. It's going to be causing a lot of problems in the world, killing not only people, but affecting the growth of plants as well. Geoengineering, some people say it's already happening, some people say it's going to happen, but in any case, what do we know? We don't know enough. You cannot affect just one thing in this world. So there's no way that by blocking out the sun, dimming the sun, or whatever are these other techniques are that they're using. And we know that they're already using them, like in Chernobyl. When Chernobyl happened in '86, the Russian government, of course, didn't tell people that they were subject to radiation. They let the May Day parades go ahead after Chernobyl, and many, many children got thyroid cancer after that. Children who were out in the parade in the open air, and people actually had physical nausea and coughing and didn't know that it was radiation. But one thing they did, like they saw the radioactive cloud moving toward Moscow, which isn't that far away from Kiev. And what they did is they seeded the clouds so that the black rain, the radioactive rain, came down before it got to Moscow. I don't know who was underneath that, but you have to realize that there are experiments in geoengineering going on in China and in the US right now, and they're being done by people who don't seem to realize that however desperate the situation is, you can't just like tinker with some aspect of it without recognizing that it's going to affect everything else. The principle of this planet is we are one system, and eventually everything goes everywhere. So we have to be careful what we're doing. We have to look at, what about, like the metaverse, trying to like create virtual reality so people can like hide away temporarily in an alternate world where they're surrounded by trees and grass or whatever it is they want. And in the real world, everything is decaying around them. This is science fiction disaster. So we have to change a lot of things, and we have to really question technology for good, and technology that even seems like it might be good could actually be very harmful for us.
Thanks, Glenda. Right, I want to conclude, as it were, on a couple of optimistic things, small but positive steps forward. And then I don't know if Brian, you want to say any last words? I don't know. I'll let you if you do. My two positive things. This will relate particularly, this is an Irish-centered comment, and it relates to Glenda and myself. We are both members of the Irish anti-war movement, and our president of this is Richard Boyd Barrett, who is also a member of the Irish Parliament, TD for People Before Profit. And he spoke yesterday in our online international anti-war rally, it had Noam Chomsky speaking at it, it had Tariq Ali, it had all sorts of people speaking on it. It was organized by Code Pink in America and the Stop the War Coalition. And speaking in that, Richard Boyd Barrett forcefully made the point about if the establishment get away with all their plans for increased militarization and so on, that it would completely destroy any attempt to stop climate change and all their plans. So that was, that was a very positive example of making the link between climate change and the general anti-war movement, international anti-war movement. And I think the more that happens, the better. And my second optimistic thing is that I believe, I wasn't there, but reports suggest that about 10,000 people were mobilized by Extinction Rebellion in the center of London yesterday on the climate issue, but they'll be thinking about the war too. So that seems to me, the more we see a return of mass action after COVID kind of put a stop to it, that is a very, very positive development for us all, and I hope that inspires other people around the world in many different ways. So, Brian, do you want have you've got any last words, or are you done now?
I'll just say thank you very much for letting me speak on this, as a part of this discussion. It's a great discussion, and I think hope to see you all soon on the streets. And as John says, and because I do believe I think the climate movement doesn't know how big it is. It needs to mobilize to see itself, I think, in a way. To gain the confidence to push for the really big changes that we need. So I'm committed to that, and I hope you all are too. So anyway, I do have to run to another meeting, but it's been great meeting you, Glenda, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Brian. Thank you so much, and thank you so much. I think that very last words we can let Thomas Hummel, who says, thanks, comrades. It's not easy for both the environment and war. We can all agree that we'll be in a much better place with a stronger and more conscious working class. Working towards that is essential. I think we can all agree, I hope, on that point. And last of all, I would say, if anybody would like to join the Global Eco-Socialist Network, where we have regular meetings and discussions of this kind on Zoom and otherwise, please go to the Global Eco-Socialist Network. I see technical support is putting it across. Join the Global Eco-Socialist Network there at our website. So once again, big thanks to Glenda. Thanks to everybody who's attended. I think it was a very good discussion. And as was said, we'll see you all on the streets, even if only in our imagination. Okay, thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks for inviting me. I appreciate the honor.
Thank you, Glenda. Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everybody.